The morning began like any other Tuesday inside the palace walls. The halls carried the ordinary weight of administrative routine, the kind of silence that precedes crisis without announcing it. But in the private quarters of the East Wing, something had shifted. A locked drawer had been opened. A document, sealed for years under explicit royal instruction, was now being read for the first time since it had been written. William stood before the mahogany cabinet, his hand resting on the folder before him. The paper inside bore the unmistakable royal seal, pressed into wax with the finality that only a monarch's authority carries. He did not move immediately. There are moments in a family's life when silence becomes heavier than words, and this was one of them. The folder contained what was known inside the family only as the protection order, a written decree established years ago, meant to remain sealed unless circumstances demanded its enforcement. Before we go deeper into what this sealed instruction truly means for the future of the family, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the full story of how this moment changed everything. The prince held the document with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that what he was about to read would reshape relationships. The wax seal bore the official mark of the late monarch, a symbol that carried weight beyond mere formality. This was not a suggestion. This was a command written to survive the person who gave it, binding on all who came after. The first page opened with language so direct, it seemed almost confrontational. William's eyes moved across the paragraph, and behind him, the room itself seemed to hold its breath. The decree stated, in unambiguous terms, that access to the protected vault, a private collection of personal items, letters, and mementos linked to the late princess, was to be permanently restricted from one specific family member, the current queen consort. The words did not soften with rereading. If anything, they hardened. The instruction continued, stating that future oversight of the vault's contents would fall under the absolute authority of the eldest grandson. No appeal, no reconsideration, no mercy clause hidden in smaller print. The monarch who wrote this had meant for it to be enforced exactly as written. Even after her passing, William lowered the page and understood immediately why this document had been sealed away. This was not a bureaucratic instruction. This was a wound, being protected by written law. Downstairs in the formal reception room, Charles sat reviewing correspondence when the message came. His son requested his presence in the private office. The king recognized the formal tone immediately. This was not a casual summons. Something official had surfaced. Charles moved through the corridors with the measured pace of someone who has spent decades learning to absorb bad news without flinching. Whatever waited for him upstairs would require the face of a sovereign, not a father. When he entered the room, William was standing exactly where Charles had stood many times before the same locked cabinet, holding papers that changed everything. The king's expression shifted minutely, and that small change carried more meaning than any announcement could have delivered. "The protection order," William said quietly. "The seal has held all these years, but there's a situation that requires it to be activated." Charles felt the weight of those words settle across his shoulders. The protection order was not theoretical. It was not a historical artifact. It was a final command from his mother, written with the knowledge that someday, perhaps in a moment exactly like this, it would need to be enforced. And that enforcement would fall to his son, not to him. The king sat down slowly, the folder now in his hands. He read through the language with the practiced eye of someone who has spent a lifetime understanding royal instructions. Each phrase confirmed what he already feared. The late monarch had drawn a permanent boundary, and that boundary was meant to be inviolable. But she had also made it clear who would hold the power to maintain it, not the reigning king, but the future one. It is said that in that moment, Charles understood something he had spent years avoiding. The past was not something the monarchy could renegotiate for comfort. The past was something that had to be respected, even when that respect required pain. "What triggered this?" he asked finally. William explained, 3 weeks prior, there had been a request, indirect but unmistakable, for access to items in the protected vault. The request had come through official channels, presented as routine archival work. When initial denial was offered, the request had been resubmitted with additional justification. There were claims that certain items needed to be accessed for historical documentation. There were suggestions that the restrictions were outdated, that times had changed, and that perhaps the original intention had been misunderstood. Then came the discovery that truly shattered any hope of treating this as a simple administrative matter. A page from the palace ledger, the official record of the vault's contents, had gone missing. Someone had taken a document that listed what was protected inside, and that document had disappeared from its secured location. This was not a request anymore. This was an attempt to circumvent the protection entirely. Before we get to what William discovered next, make sure you're following along, because what happens next will show you exactly how one sealed decree can tear open every unresolved wound in a family. The Queen Consort received notification of the situation in a way that was, according to those present, startlingly clinical. No personal visit, no private conversation with the king, simply a formal statement delivered through official channels, informing her that her previous request for vault access had been permanently denied under royal instruction, and that any future attempts at circumvention would be met with formal enforcement action. Camilla read the message in her private apartments, and those who saw her afterward reported that her expression did not show anger. It showed something more dangerous, a kind of absolute stillness that comes when someone realizes they have been rejected, not by a person, but by documented law. This was not a refusal that could be softened through conversation. This was not a boundary that could be negotiated through time and patience. The late monarch had reached across her own death to say no, and that no was now being enforced by her grandson with an authority the Queen Consort could not challenge. She requested a private meeting with Charles. The king agreed, though he knew what this meeting would demand of him. It would require him to uphold a command that wounded his own household. It would demand that he choose his mother's instructions over his wife's pain. It would force him to become the mechanism through which his mother's will was being executed years after she was gone. When they met, the conversation reportedly moved through stages that revealed exactly why the original instruction had been sealed. Camilla did not ask for mercy. She asked for context, for some explanation of why the restriction existed at all. Charles could not give her that answer without revealing things that had been deliberately protected for decades. The vault, he explained carefully, contained items of profound personal significance, letters, personal mementos, objects tied to a period of the family's history that was still too raw for casual handling. The restriction was not about punishment. It was about protection of a private legacy from being examined or perhaps misused. For whom is it being protected? Camilla asked, and the question hung in the air with the weight of a verdict. Charles could not answer without hurting her further. The protection was for the son of the woman whose private life was locked away. It was for the grandson who had lost his mother's presence and needed to maintain her dignity in the only way remaining to him. The vault was not about defending against Camilla specifically. It was about maintaining a sacred space that could not be violated without violating the person it contained. Camilla listened, and reportedly her response was steady but final. She would not challenge the decree. She would not attempt further access, but neither would she pretend this was anything less than what it was, a final, irreversible boundary that the family's current ruler had placed between her and a past that she had been explicitly shut out from. She left the meeting with the understanding that some rejections are not temporary, some are permanent by design. Meanwhile, William was still investigating the missing ledger page. This was not a small matter. The palace maintained meticulous records, and something as significant as a missing document required immediate action. The prince worked quietly with the palace's archival team, tracing the page's removal and attempting to determine who had accessed it and when. What they discovered was both relieving and troubling. The page had not been stolen by an intruder or removed for sale on the black market. It had been taken by someone with legitimate access, someone with the authority to move through the palace's protected areas. The removal had been deliberate, and according to the records of who had accessed the ledger that day, the person responsible had done so under the assumption that they were following official instructions. Someone inside the palace structure had suggested that the page should be retrieved for review. Someone had authorized its removal, and in doing so, They had set in motion the crisis that had now forced the protection order out of sealed obscurity and into active enforcement. William discovered that the authorization had been indirect, a suggestion from someone in the household that the historical record should be updated, that certain items might need to be verified as still in secure storage. It was presented as routine maintenance, but the result was the same, a deliberate effort to access information that was protected by the late monarch's explicit instruction. The prince understood immediately what this meant. The protection order was not theoretical, it was actively being challenged, and the challenge was coming from within the family structure itself. After everything William learned, the most difficult part was what came next, because now he had to choose between keeping the protection order secret and enforcing it, knowing that enforcement meant public acknowledgement of a family conflict that had been successfully hidden for years. He met again with Catherine, his partner, seeking counsel on what came next. The princess listened to the full situation with the kind of calm that comes from understanding both duty and its human cost. She did not tell him what to do. Instead, she asked him what his mother, the person who had written the protection order, would have expected. The question shifted something in William. The order was not about Camilla. It was not about punishment. It was about honor, about ensuring that a private legacy remained protected regardless of pressure, time, or family dynamics. The protection could not be honored while remaining secret. It could only be honored through enforcement. Then you have to enforce it, Catherine said simply, not because it will feel good, but because it's the right thing to do. Before we show what happened next, we need to understand what this protection order actually protected and why it mattered so deeply. The vault itself was not a dramatic setting. It was a secure room containing the personal effects of the late princess, items that had been gathered and protected after her death. Some of these items were deeply private, letters written by her own hand, personal journals, pieces of jewelry with intimate significance. These were not public artifacts. They were not meant for historical record or royal documentation. They were meant to remain private because they carried the weight of a person's unfiltered truth. For William, maintaining this protection was not about excluding anyone. It was about saying that some aspects of a person's life remain sacred even after that person is gone, even if it was inconvenient, even if it hurt, even if powerful people wanted access and had reasons that seemed rational. The enforcement began quietly. William met with senior palace staff and made clear that the protection order was now active and would be enforced absolutely. The vault would remain secured. The ledger would be restored to its complete form. Any future request for access would be denied immediately, without negotiation or delay. But the prince did something that revealed his maturity. He did not shame anyone. He did not announce the conflict publicly. He did not turn Camilla into a target or present the family conflict as a scandal. He simply made clear that the boundary existed, was final, and would be maintained. For 3 days, the situation remained contained within the palace. Then, as these things always do in the modern world, the story escaped. A palace correspondent, reportedly working from leaked information, published the first article. The headline was brutal in its simplicity. Royal vault sealed, access denied to Queen Consort by late monarch's final instruction. Beside the headline ran a photograph of the late princess, and beside that, an image of William, creating a visual narrative that did not require explanation. The story spread immediately. Within hours, it had moved from the correspondent's publication to major news outlets across the country. The narrative was simple enough. The late monarch had written a document protecting her private legacy, and that document explicitly barred one specific family member from ever accessing it. The emotion was immediate. The implications were vast. Public sentiment mobilized quickly. Crowds gathered outside the palace, many bringing flowers or photographs, gestures of remembrance that transformed the story from internal family conflict into something larger. Diana's name, which had been carefully managed within royal circles, suddenly returned to dominate national conversation. What made the coverage particularly damaging was how it framed the situation. It was not presented as a protection order meant to honor a private legacy. It was presented as a rejection, a judgment, a final condemnation, delivered from beyond death. the Queen Consort was depicted not as someone bound by a prior instruction, but as someone being publicly shamed by her late husband's former wife. Camilla watched the coverage with a stillness that those around her found deeply troubling. She had accepted the private rejection. She could not accept the public humiliation. Every article seemed to confirm something she had feared, that she would never be allowed to fully enter the history of this family, that some boundaries would remain permanently closed, and that those boundaries would be enforced publicly if necessary. Charles felt the weight of this too. The king had accepted William's decision to enforce the protection order, but he had not anticipated how the public would transform private pain into national spectacle. The barrier between family conflict and public scandal had collapsed, and now his wife's hurt was being examined and debated by millions of people. William realized, watching the coverage, that he had made a calculation that proved incomplete. He had assumed that quiet enforcement would keep the matter private. He had not accounted for the power of a sealed decree to capture public imagination. He had not understood that protecting his mother's memory through legal enforcement would be experienced by millions as a kind of judgment against his stepmother. Catherine proved crucial in what came next. The princess understood that the palace response would shape how this story was ultimately remembered. A wrong statement could turn William into a weapon and Camilla into a victim. The palace team began drafting responses, each one too harsh, each one too defensive. Catherine reviewed them all and rejected them, suggesting instead language that was firm without being cruel. The palace, she argued, should confirm the protection order's existence without attacking anyone. It should honor the late monarch's wishes without humiliating the living. It should maintain the boundary while protecting everyone's dignity. The final statement was approved by Charles. It confirmed that the late monarch had established clear instructions regarding her private collection. It affirmed that those instructions would be honored. It explicitly refused to attack the Queen Consort, instead suggesting that this was about respecting the wishes of a deceased family member. It closed with language about duty and respect, allowing the public to understand this as a matter of principle rather than personal conflict. The statement did not satisfy everyone, but it did something crucial. It shifted the narrative from scandal to duty. Gradually, the public began to understand this, not as a family war, but as a family honoring the final wishes of their late matriarch. Meanwhile, William was having a different conversation with Charles. The prince understood that his father had been placed in an impossible position, forced to uphold a command that wounded his own household, forced to watch his wife suffer in public, forced to navigate between his duty to his mother's memory and his duty to his wife's well-being. They met privately, and William offered something that changed the shape of the crisis. He would enforce the protection order absolutely. It would remain sealed. No future access would be granted, but he would do so without public dispute. He would accept that Camilla had been hurt. He would acknowledge that his father had made a difficult choice in supporting the enforcement, and he would work actively to ensure that this boundary was maintained without turning it into an ongoing family wound. Charles, hearing this, finally understood something he had needed to understand for years. The protection order was not about denying Camilla. It was about William learning that power exercised with restraint is more powerful than power exercised with cruelty. His son was becoming the kind of leader who could enforce difficult boundaries while maintaining the dignity of everyone involved. "You'll protect the vault, absolutely?" Charles asked. "Yes," William replied, "but with respect, without humiliation, without treating this as a victory." The king accepted this, and in accepting it, he released some of the burden he had been carrying. His son would enforce his mother's wishes. His wife would not be publicly destroyed. The family would move forward, wounded but whole. The missing ledger page was recovered not by any dramatic revelation, but simply by searching the places where it had been temporarily stored during the archival review process. When it was found, it contained no shocking secrets. It simply listed the contents of the vault with clinical precision. But its recovery allowed the palace to restore the official record and confirm that all protected items remained secure and undisturbed. This practical resolution, though lacking drama, actually proved more effective than any confrontation could have been. The ledger page's recovery suggested that the breach had been unintentional, that no actual theft or violation had occurred and that the protection order had worked exactly as intended. No one had successfully accessed the vault. The late monarch's final instructions had held. Days passed, then weeks. The public attention gradually faded. The crowds outside the palace dispersed. The story moved from the front pages to occasional retrospective pieces, and inside the palace, life continued, changed but not destroyed. William completed the formal enforcement by signing the official order that made the protection binding in perpetuity. This was not merely a confirmation. This was the future king, placing his own authority behind his mother's wishes, saying that the protection would continue, not just because the late monarch had written it, but because he believed it was right. When he signed the order, he did so with complete awareness of what it meant. This was his choice. This was his decision. This was him, as the future king, exercising authority to honor the past rather than change it. It was a moment that revealed his understanding of kingship itself, not as the power to rewrite history, but as the responsibility to honor it. Camilla did not fight the enforcement. She did not challenge it publicly. She did not attempt any further access, but neither did she pretend that the boundary did not hurt. She carried the wound, but she carried it with the dignity that comes from accepting what cannot be changed. Charles watched his son sign the enforcement order and felt visible sadness. The king recognized that his mother's final command had done exactly what she intended. It had protected Diana's legacy. It had forced his son into mature authority, and it had made him face, finally, the cost of carrying unresolved history. But something had shifted during the crisis. Because William had chosen to enforce the protection with restraint, the family had not been destroyed. Camilla's dignity, though bruised, remained intact. Charles's role as king had been affirmed rather than challenged, and William had proven that he understood the kind of power that builds institutions rather than tears them apart. Catherine stood beside William as the papers were filed away. The princess did not look triumphant. She did not need to. Her presence alone carried the meaning of the moment. She had helped a future king learn that the hardest choices require not just decision, but grace. In the end, the protection order revealed something fundamental about the monarchy itself. It showed where grief still lived, untouched and protected. It showed where loyalty still mattered, even at cost. It showed that some boundaries were worth maintaining, even when maintaining them hurt. Diana's vault remained sealed, but something else had opened. William had finally understood what his mother's death meant, not an ending that needed to be processed and moved past, but a lasting obligation to protect what she had left behind. The letters, the mementos, the private aspects of her life, these were no longer just personal artifacts. They were sacred trust held by her son against anyone who might diminish them. The late monarch had written the protection order because she knew what would happen after her death. She knew that time would soften the edges of family conflict. She knew that people would rationalize boundary violations as healing or progress. She knew that pain would make her family vulnerable to the idea that moving past the past meant moving past protection. So she had written a command that would survive her, enforced by the son who best understood why it was necessary. The monarchy emerged from this crisis not unchanged, but steadier, because this time it had chosen to honor the past rather than deny it. It had chosen restraint over spectacle. It had chosen the protection of private dignity over public vindication. William closed the file, not as a wounded son seeking revenge, but as a future king choosing the harder path of protection and duty. The vault would remain sealed, the boundary would remain firm, and the family would move forward, carrying the weight of honoring a final instruction that asked everything of them. For the first time in years, the late princess's memory was finally completely protected, not through forgetting, but through dedication, through a son who understood that love sometimes means saying no, through a king who learned that duty demands pain, through a princess who knew that the strongest leadership is the kind that holds firm without breaking others. The sealed decree had done more than protect a vault. It had protected the family's capacity to honor truth, even when truth was difficult to live with. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive into the stories that shape history and families. We'll see you in the next one.